This is the Doing Business School Abroad podcast. I'm Ken Globerman, and if you're interested in going to business school somewhere out of your country, this is definitely the podcast series for you. This is episode 3, Making Your List of Schools. Welcome back to our podcast series, Doing Business School Abroad. This is episode 3. I'm your host, Ken Globerman, founder of No Brainer. And today we're going to talk about making your list of schools to apply to, right? So once you've determined that your vision is, hey, yes, I want to go to business school. Now you've got to choose from the hundreds and hundreds of business schools around the world. Oh my God, how are you going to choose? How many to choose? How many to apply to? There's just so many decisions to make here, right? So let's step back first of all and talk about what is business school, right? And because many people, when I hear people talk about business school, actually define that separately from university, right? So in many countries, the business schools that are there, let's take here in Warsaw, the Warsaw School of Economics is the sort of local, in my opinion, best business school in Warsaw, if not Poland. But people at that school actually differentiate itself from the universities in Warsaw. So the University of Warsaw is another very wonderful, prestigious school, which offers many different types of curricula. And whereas a business school like SGH, which is the acronym for Warsaw School of Economics, is simply a business school. In the United States and many other countries, business schools usually sit inside of universities. So they're sometimes referred to as a college within the university, or we might call it a faculty within the university. There are exceptions to that, though. So, for example, in NYU, New York University, my alma mater, there's the Stern School of Business. In Harvard University, there's Harvard Business School. In University of Pennsylvania, there's Wharton Business School. In Northwestern University, there's the Kellogg School of Business, right? So there are these business schools that sit within. Now, there are some exceptions, like London Business School is an entity of itself, right? It is not associated with a sort of overarching university on top of it. And there are other examples like that, but most of the time, business schools are business faculties that sit within larger universities. Now, what criteria do you want to consider? Or let's start with how many schools should you in fact target? You know what? This is really a personal question. And when we're talking about business school, of course, it can be time consuming and financially costly to apply to many schools. So I can tell you, when I applied to business school, I think that I applied to perhaps 7 or 8 schools. And I would advise people in general to try to limit it to as many as 10, and perhaps consider as much as 5. I just feel 5 to 10 schools is a general nice number. Of course, you may have your heart set on one school and say, screw it, I don't want to apply to 5 to 10 schools. I'm going to apply only to this one, and if I don't get in, well, I just won't go. So it is a personal decision, but without knowing your personal criteria, I would say generally 5 to 10 is probably a good number to consider. Now, what are the criteria to consider, right? Once you've got your set down to those, to sort of choosing 5 to 10, obviously the first one is going to be cost. Let's face it, cost is definitely a really important criteria. And in fact, one of the major points as to why one might consider going abroad. In the United States, most of the top business schools cost as much as $60,000 a year. Yes, I'll repeat that number again. $60,000 a year. And by the way, that's up from, I think, the $30,000 a year that it cost when I went to Stern, which was only about 20 years ago. So the cost of business schools in the United States has roughly doubled in the last 20 years. And frankly, the cost of higher education in the United States has doubled in the last 20 years. And that's a whole separate conversation we can have. But that's just giving you that data point. Now let's talk about some other programs, because I think what people don't realize is that programs in different countries can have price tags that value greatly. Now, some of the prestigious schools in the UK for a master's degree or MBA programs are also sort of in the range of £40,000 a year, for example. So, almost to the same range as the sort of a top US business school. When we look at other prestigious schools around Europe, the price tag is often sort of in the sort of 25 to 35,000 euro range. And then I think it's important to point out, though, it doesn't have to cost that much. For example, a really, really, I would say, hidden secret is that if you are looking for cost economy at a nationally ranked Western European university, you don't have to look farther than the Rotterdam School of Management in the Netherlands, where if you're an EU citizen, you can get your master's degree for under 3,000 euro for the year. Yes, that's 3,000 euro. In fact, it's 2,600 euro for that one-year master's for EU citizens. How awesome is that? For a fraction of the money, you can study in the Netherlands at a wonderful university. And if you're not an EU citizen, it's still relatively economical. You can study for 22,000 euro, which is a lot less than the price tag in neighboring countries in Western Europe. So, and why is that? You can thank the government, which is basically subsidizing education for EU citizens at that school. So, cost is obviously a factor, so we can't hide that. Now, cost aside, you obviously want to consider the programs and the specialties, right? So if you know, for example, that you want to focus on finance, then you probably would look to a school like in the U.S., Wharton or Stern, the NYU Stern School of Business. If you were looking towards general management or marketing in the U.S., for example, you might be looking at Kellogg at Northwestern or Harvard University or Stanford for that matter, right? So different schools have their sort of different strengths. The same thing goes in Europe. So you want to do your homework and throughout the world, by the way, right? So you definitely want to do your homework and find out which schools have the most well-known faculty for the area that you're interested in concentrating in, whether it be management, marketing, entrepreneurship, finance, or any of the other major disciplines of business. Let me just kind of zero in on entrepreneurship for a second, because it's kind of like a buzzword that's sort of been around for the last decade and something that a lot of people want to focus on. In fact, I did sort of I was part of the entrepreneurial project at NYU many, many years ago, which is now known as the Berkeley Center for Entrepreneurship. If entrepreneurship is something that you're interested in, you definitely want to find a school that focuses on it well. Every school is going to say, not every school, but many, many schools, because this sort of entrepreneurship is so sort of big in the global arena today. Many schools say they have an entrepreneurial focus. You really want to do your diligence and check to really understand how true that is, right? So the things you want to be looking at are, do they have like programs, strong programs to mentor you with business professionals? Do they have any type of accelerator or incubator program that many students can participate in? Do they have any type of business plan competitions that are well known? The prize money is irrelevant, frankly. You just want to know if actually the substance is there. And what do the students do upon graduating? You want to look at the sort of profile of students and how many of them actually go on to actually starting their own business. So not only sort of talk about entrepreneurship, but actually do it. So definitely be selective and do your homework if entrepreneurship is something that you are considering. Beyond that, you want to think about the profile of the Alumni Network. So if your interest is to work, for example, in an investment bank, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, a mid-tier bank, a commercial bank, you want to get a sense for, how many students that have graduated from that program have now gone on to work at those types of institutions. If your interest is not financial services, but instead FMCG, then you want to obviously look at that. How many are working for companies like Procter & Gamble, Danone, Colgate-Palmolive, and the many other larger players that are out there in the the packaged goods arena. So definitely keep that in mind. Beyond that, then you can start getting into some of the other criteria, such as the metrics for admissions, right? So the key metrics for admissions to business school, besides your CV, resume in the United States, are your test scores and your grade point average. So you'd want to obviously do your diligence and understand what the typical profile is in the schools you're considering. And most schools won't give you like a minimum threshold, but they'll kind of tell you the profile of their typical admissions class. They might give you a median GMAT score, or they might tell you that 80% of the student body falls in a certain GMAT score range. They'll give you some guideposts to kind of give you a sense, right? So I think once you start doing your sort of homework on this subject, you'll start to see that the prestigious programs usually like to see GMAT scores in the upper 600s going into the 700s. The sort of tier below that sort of looks for scores that are in the low to mid 600s. And then everyone else tends to sort of fall into that roughly, though no one puts it on their website, I would say, let's call it mid 500s and up, right? The median GMAT score is around 530, 540, 550. So no one's going to advertise, come to us with a 400 GMAT score, obviously. Though I'm sure people get into business school with 400 so on GMAT scores if their application is stellar in other areas. But you want to get a sense of what your GMAT score is going to look like to give you a sense of if you'll be competitive at your consideration set of business schools. And by the way, if your school is promoting that that the average GMAT score is 700, and you happen to think that or only have scored 640, I wouldn't necessarily count that out, okay? Because there's no hard rule typically across the admissions process. At least in my interaction with admissions officers, they'll rarely tell you that there's a hard rule on that topic. And now pivoting off of the GMAT score, your grade point average is the same thing, right? And this is even harder to deal with because at least the GMAT is a standardized exam globally, whereas GPAs can be different across every university, across countries around the world, right? I mean, Carnegie Mellon, for example, where I did my undergraduate studies in, didn't have a GPA with a plus and minus system. So you only can get an A, B, C, D, or failing grade. Those were your only choices. In some schools, you can actually get an A plus, which might be counted as something higher than a 4.0. In other schools, they won't even give you anything lower than a C minus. Because they wouldn't give you a D, for example. Perhaps they go sort of from C minus right to fail, right? So then that sort of artificially perhaps even inflates your GMAT, your grade point average at that particular university. So every school's policy on how they dish out grades is going to impact how your GPA is going to look from that university. Other schools grade on sort of a sliding scale based on the student body. Other schools don't, right? So it becomes very hard for an admissions officer to look at one GPA from someone in one school and compare it to your GPA from another school. They do their best to deal with it, but recognize that just the GPA number is not the whole story, and I think admissions officers know that. For example, when I got into Carnegie Mellon, my GPA was by no means. When I got into Stern School of Business, my GPA at Carnegie Mellon was no stellar GPA. Okay, in fact, many would say by my GPA that I wouldn't have gotten admitted to any top business school, but in the end, I did. So I never tell people that they don't have a shot if one metric is off. Now, I didn't mention GRE, but I'll just say briefly that some business schools will accept not only the GMAT, but also the GRE exam for entrance. So you need to check whether or not the GMAT or the GRE is accepted as part of the application process. And we'll talk more about those exams in a later podcast in the series, so I won't get into that now. Beyond that, in your list of schools, you want to consider also what language you want to study in. So if you want to study in English, obviously you want to look at global MBA or global masters or MBA programs where most courses are offered in English. If you want to study in French or Spanish, obviously then you would look at schools where you can study in those languages. If you want to learn Mandarin or Japanese, you would obviously be looking at schools in China or Japan, respectively. So think about culturally what languages you want to study in, and also on that same note, from a regional perspective, what countries or what regions of the world you want to study in. And your reason for that might be are multifold, actually, right? Because you might have just a personal vested interest in studying in a particular part of the world, or you may have a professional interest in gaining some sort of initial traction in a particular part of the world where you might later want to work in. So, for example, if you see that India is a country that you're attracted to both personally and professionally, because later on you want to focus your career on what's going on in Southern Asia, then it might behoove you to look at programs in and around India, or at programs that Indian firms are highly attracted to, whether they be in the Middle East or in Europe or wherever they may be. So those regional decision points are a big part of the process as well. I think that kind of covers it. So, you know what? Let's actually stop here. Once you've done that homework or that diligence, and you've gotten your sort of school decision set down, the next part of the process is to deal with the details of the admissions process itself. So that's the subject of the next episode in this series. So for this moment, I'll wish you a wonderful day and say that this is Ken Globerman signing off. Take care. Until episode 4, see you later.